You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Your host, Michael, on a Friday morning. I have some thoughts for a recent convert to Orthodoxy that I wanted to offer. By the way, I do want to commend this person, and just came across their content yesterday in my feed. Came up one of their videos, From Atheist to Orthodox Christian, My Journey to Christ. And it seems that this person, her name is Jasmyne Theodora. She went from like paganism and other, it seems like maybe even occult practices to orthodoxy, and I'm happy to hear that. I mean, hats off to her. I mean, these days, isn't it kind of the opposite? The people are going from Christianity to paganism and those things, and so it's nice to see somebody who says, no, I'm going to make the journey in the opposite direction. And so I'm happy to hear that she's in Christ and has reformed her life. So hats off to her. She does offer some thoughts on why she considered Orthodoxy instead of Catholicism in the video. It's only about 3 minutes for that section. So I'm going to review that part and offer some of my thoughts in response to that. And then I also want to talk about the interaction that we had in the comment section, because I think it's very enlightening. And I also think that it would help others who are recent converts to Orthodoxy. But really, he's just recent converts to anything. By the way, I think I had a little bit of a feedback. Sorry, I turned the monitors down there. But I think this would also just help for recent converts to anybody, because I think you'll see some of the difficulties that new converts begin to experience. All right, let's pull up the video, and like I said, I'm going to review the 3 minutes of the video, and then I am going to talk about our comments there in the comment section, because we had a brief discussion there. Again, it's called From Atheist to Orthodox Christian, My Journey to Christ. And once more, just because I am, as I always say on the show, just because I am engaging a person's arguments doesn't mean that that is a personal attack. It doesn't mean that I question their salvation or sincerity. No, I am going to interact with what she is saying about Catholicism, while not making any judgments on her. In fact, I assume that she's in Christ and has had this wonderful transformation that she testifies to, and I'm happy to hear that. I think that you're going in the right direction. I mean, you're just shy of the fullness of the faith, and especially going from paganism to Orthodoxy. You made a good move there, in my opinion. So, all right. Let me know in the chat, by the way, if y'all can't hear anything as far as the audio. Let's start here.
Orthodoxy instead of Catholicism or Protestantism or non-denominationalism. I love this quote by Seraphim Rose.
And that's of course why y'all know why I go by Michael Seraphim Lofton, right? Because Seraphim of Seraph. Now these obviously different of than Seraphim Rose, but Seraphim of Seraph is my Orthodox confirmation saint name. So I love all of the Seraphims in Orthodoxy. Seraphim Rose was a really, really interesting figure. I need to do a separate stream on him, but let's continue.
Only one place is there to be found, the fount of true teaching coming from God himself, not diminished over the centuries, but ever fresh, being one and the same in all those who truly teach it, leading those who follow it to eternal salvation. This place is the Orthodox Church of Christ. The fount is the grace of the Holy Spirit, and the true teachers of the divine doctrine that issues from the fount are the Holy Fathers of the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, no, these kinds of triumphalistic quotes by figures like Seraphim, and we have our own share of those in Catholicism, right? Especially from that time period, right? Um, we we certainly have made some triumphalistic quotes. I don't think anything that's entirely incompatible with anything that is said today, but I'm just saying sometimes we've taken that same stance there. And obviously I would challenge Seraphim Rose on that. I mean, this kind of pristine ideal understanding of orthodoxy doesn't really just stand up when you look at it historically. However, I would say, to go to bat for the Eastern Orthodox, I would say that they've preserved the substance of the deposit of faith. You might say, but they reject the papacy, they reject the filioque. I understand that, but the framework for the papacy and the framework for the filioque they maintain. So it's like they maintain the material, but they haven't necessarily just put it together. I mean, think of it like this: they have the whole Lego set. All of the pieces are there. They just haven't necessarily finished putting it together yet. So in a sense, I kind of want to defend what Seraphim is saying relatively, just insofar as the Orthodox have preserved the deposit of faith. But have they put it together and seen how it should logically develop, and what are some of its implications? And, have they been entirely consistent with their own conciliar tradition? I'm going to say no. So in that sense, I'm actually going to give some pushback to Seraphim Rose there. But okay, let's continue.
The Orthodox Church, the scriptures are preserved without falsification, without addition or curtailment. In the Orthodox Church, the scriptures are read without distortion, and thus.
But doesn't that kind of assume the Orthodox position, the Orthodox canon? Again, I'm going to go to bat for Orthodoxy here and defend their canon. I'm just saying, I'm just noticing an assertion rather than an actual apologetic defense. And, maybe that was her intention. Maybe all her intention was just to simply assert the case of orthodoxy. Well, okay, if that's all one is doing, that's fine. But that's only going to have just a little bit of utility. I mean, it would be a whole lot more helpful to actually demonstrate the claims of orthodoxy, because a Protestant who might watch this, or a Catholic might offer some pushback, especially a Protestant, because they're going to have a different canon. So the Protestant is going to say, but you have added to scripture, you've added these books. And so one is going to need to address that.
Thus, the Orthodox Church is the custodian of truth because it possesses Holy Scripture, not its text only, but also its correct interpretation.
But see, that's a problem already, because when we speak of the Orthodox as custodians, where's the magisterium to be this custodian? There is no objective magisterium. You do have the local bishop on the local level. You do have the Synod of Bishops a little bit above that. But beyond that, you don't have anything. You don't have an objective way to identify an ecumenical council, for example. So how do you really speak of orthodoxy as a custodian of the correct interpretation of the deposit of faith or sacred scripture, when there's no way to objectively settle a theological dispute in orthodoxy since the disappearance of the last Roman emperor? It was generally the emperor who was kind of able to coerce, subjects in his empire to maintain what he felt they needed to maintain. But it was, after the emperor, there's a reason why you don't really have pan-Orthodox synods. There's a reason why you don't have ecumenical councils. I mean, very, very rare exceptions here, but they tend to be ad hoc rather than something that is objective. And that's why you see figures like Florovsky admitting, yeah, we don't really have an objective way to identify ecumenical councils. They're just spontaneous events of the Holy Spirit. Okay, well, a Protestant can say the same thing. So how is Orthodoxy any better than Protestantism at this point? Whenever we're just now appealing to a spontaneous act of the Holy Spirit, a Protestant can just locate that in the individual and say, the Holy Spirit spontaneously tells me that this is the truth. There's no objectivity to that. So it sounds nice at first to new converts. Oh, they're the custodians of the truth and they have the correct interpretation. It sounds nice until you start to dig deep. By the way, I saw this from Victoria in the chat, who's Eastern Orthodox. She says, the Lego set was completed when delivered. That's absurd. with all due respect, Victoria, come on. I think we both know that that's not the case. I mean, was Paul venerating icons in the first century? No. And if he was, why didn't the Jews say, you're an idolater? Even though I know icon veneration is not idolatry, that's exactly what the Jews would have told him. But they didn't say that. They didn't say that of any Christians. You don't have any record that we were guilty of idolatry in that sense. Now, they did start to call our relic veneration idolaters. And by the way, veneration of relics does tie into and give justification to veneration of icons. But they weren't venerating icons in the first century. So again, this idea that the Lego set was completed when delivered is absurd. However, I will say that it was completed in the sense of the Lego set is given. Yeah, we all agree there. But was it all put together in the shape of a boat or something like that? No. Even Irenaeus tells you that's not the case. Read St. Irenaeus Against Heresies. He uses the analogy of a mosaic. And so even he would acknowledge what I'm saying in here, and he's again 2nd century figure who was the last of within living memory of the apostles, as they say. All right, let's continue.
Holy Orthodoxy has been around since before the New Testament Holy Scriptures were even put to paper and compiled. The Church is the one church that knows the original Greek of the New Testament.
But see, when we say that the Orthodox Church was the one that was around before the compilation of the New Testament, in a sense, I agree, because I believe that Orthodox have apostolic succession going back to the apostles. But when we speak of the Orthodox as the church, as opposed to Catholicism or something like that, that's when I think we come up into some difficulties, because now we're going to have to ask the question, how do you identify the universal church? And Orthodoxy is not going to have a real answer there. They're going to give you an answer that is circular and kind of assumes the answer, or begs the question, I should say. So here my concern is that I'm just seeing an assertion of the Orthodox claims rather than a defense. Ernst, I guess. Lofton, why do you care to make a video about an Eastern Orthodox convert? Is this really relevant? Most certainly. Why would it not be? Do you think that people don't matter? I'm really thrown off by your question. Can you elaborate that for me? Why would Eastern Orthodoxy not be important and worth our time? Are you saying that as Catholics we should just ignore Eastern Orthodox? Or are you just saying we should ignore converts, like recent converts? I don't think any of that is true. I think it's important for us to consider the Orthodox claims and to engage them, and to also call them to the fullness of the faith. And I also think that as far as just like new converts, why address new converts? Because I think that they need to see that there are some other options out there that they did not consider. And it's important to start considering those things if they want to be part of the church that Christ established. Now, I'm going to say that Orthodox already, part of it insofar as their local churches, but they're not fully experiencing it because they lack that universality. So I do think that we should consider the communion with the universal aspect, if you will, of Christ's institution. But I did do a whole show on this the other day of whether or not your salvation literally depends on this in all instances. Go and watch that. It was maybe 3 or 4 days ago, and it was called like a response to let me just look it up. Okay. Again, when you've done over 1,000 videos, it's in a little over 3 years, you tend to forget the names of your videos. So the name of the video is Response to a Former Orthodox Priest on the Anxiety of Exclusivism. So that's a response to Joshua Shuping, who was formerly an Eastern Orthodox priest who left for Protestantism, in his discussion with Gavin Orland. So go and check that out, because what I've just said about the Orthodox, needing to discern the fullness of the faith needs to be qualified. in light of those comments that I made there, because they could certainly be misunderstood. But anyways, yeah. Ernst, I don't know where you're coming from on that one. Can you explain that one to me? I don't see you offering any clarification in the chat, at least not yet. So let's move forward.
And to use the same Old Testament that Christ himself used. The Bible is actually based on the Orthodox Church. The Bible was not compiled as we know it until the First Ecumenical Council in around the year 300, 270 years after the death and resurrection of Christ.
Well, I don't know about that one. Let me make sure I heard that correctly. I don't want to, contend against a strong man. Let me make sure I heard that correctly.
Knows the original Greek of the New Testament and to use the same Old Testament that Christ himself used.
Christ is attributed to have used the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, if I recall correctly. So, he used both the Greek and the Hebrew version, if I recall correctly. But okay, let's move on.
The Bible is actually based on the Orthodox Church. The Bible was not compiled as we know it until the First Ecumenical Council.
Okay, so the Bible wasn't compiled until the First Ecumenical Council. Well, this comes from Dan Brown, but it doesn't come from actual church history. Even Orthodox don't believe this. This is not what Eastern Orthodox believe. This is not what really any Christians believe. This is what, non-Christians like Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code tell us. The First Ecumenical Council did not assemble the canon. There are some curious quotes, by the way, later on from Jerome, where he talks about Nicaea determining the canon. Yet, but there's no evidence extant of that, really. And if it did, why did we then have the councils of Rome in 382, Carthage and Hippo, and the turn of the 5th century, identifying the canon in those regions? Why did we have that if the Ecumenical Council already identified the canon? So, Orthodox Catholics, we all recognize, Nicaea I didn't actually determine the canon. So that's misinformation there. Now, I would say, well, if we got that one wrong, have we really evaluated Catholicism sufficiently? If we're making the claim that the First Ecumenical Council compiled the canon, might it be that we haven't really looked into the claims of even Eastern Orthodoxy very well? Because I've heard an assertion of Orthodoxy, just blanket assertions of Eastern Orthodoxy being the church established by Christ and the one that preceded the canon and all this and that. I'm hearing all that, but then I'm also not hearing an awareness of the historical compilation of the canon and how that went about. So if we haven't looked into that, but we're making blanket assertions about the canon, I wonder if the blanket assertions that we're making about Eastern Orthodoxy were well researched.
So in around the year 300, 270 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. And from 33 AD to 300, a ton of documents were produced that explained church beliefs and procedure taught by the apostles and those they taught. So there is a litany of documents.
I wonder what she's referring to. Maybe the Didache or the Apostolic Constitutions. I know there's some debate on the dating of the Apostolic Constitutions, but maybe she's referring to those
documents that exist outside of the Bible that were written by the apostles and their direct students that outline procedure and such. Confession was taught from the very beginning, along with incense.
Confession. I mean, you do have a vague general concept of confession in the very beginning. But you don't have confession as it's been developed in Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism until much, much, much later. I mean, in the early days, if anyone went to confession, it was like once in a lifetime. Whereas now in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, we have frequent confession. That's a pretty big jump. And back then it was a public thing, whereas now it tends to be private. So there have been a lot of developments to confession since the 1st century. So when we say it's there from the beginning, yes and no. Substantially, it's there, but in the way that we have it and understand it today, there's been a lot of development, a lot. Incense, iconostasis, icons, those were, I mean, the iconostasis was certainly not there from the beginning. Icons were certainly not there from the beginning. Now you do have early on Christians having images. You can find that really early on. Second century, you can see images, Christian images. But the question is, were they venerating those images? That's a different question. So you do see early on the use of images, but what were they using them for? Pictorial explanations of things, like St. Gregory the Great says, or to venerate them, you know. Now I'm going to go to bat for venerating icons, right? I'm going to go to bat for these things, but I'm going to say that practice of venerating icons is post-apostolic, but the justification for venerating icons is apostolic. So I don't think that this is a post-apostolic innovation in toto. I just want to say it's a development to that which has been given to us in the first century. So incense, I mean, well, you had incense being used in the in temple worship. But incense in the liturgy, like a Christian liturgy, the problem is you don't even have a unified Christian liturgy in the first, second century. So you don't, you might speak of it just like a vague skeleton structure, as we see with Justin Martyr in the second century, but there's no real like developed liturgy. So I don't know about the use of incense like being consistently used by Christians in an early liturgy. I don't think they would have been opposed to it, because they would have been coming out of Old Testament worship and temple worship and synagogue worship. So they would have come out of those things that did use incense. So I don't think they would have been entirely opposed to it. But the liturgy that you see today in the Divine Liturgy of Chrysostom that we in Eastern Catholicism celebrate as well, that liturgy is not like, that's not the form of liturgy that they were celebrating in the first century. But it sounds like she thinks that that's the case, because how many Orthodox will sell this to new converts in that way? And the problem is that new convert then starts to look into history, and then they're like, okay, well, that wasn't true. Okay, well, this wasn't true. Okay, that wasn't true. And when they discover all those things, they then start to feel like, well, I was sold a bill of goods. And at that point, they may leave Orthodoxy and just leave Christianity altogether, and they may just go somewhere else. But that causes an unnecessary amount of turmoil in that convert's life, because they were already kind of told something that wasn't true. So this idea that you just have this liturgy in the first century, that from the very beginning you have an iconostasis, absurd. That can't be defended historically. That's absurd. That being said, I'm going to defend the Divine Liturgy of Chrysostom and all of our other liturgies. I'm going to defend them as apostolic over against the Protestants in substance, apostolic in substance, but not in their developed form. Okay.
The iconostasis, icons, veneration of saints, praying to saints, which is not the same as worshiping or asking for forgiveness. It is not.
Venerating saints, praying to saints. This one's a little bit harder to defend as well. I have seen grave sites and things like that in catacombs in the second century Rome. At least that's where they're dating them to, where you see like a Christian asking for their dead child to pray for them or something like that. So I think you do have early on this idea of the intercession of the saints, but it is pretty hard to demonstrate because there's just not a lot of evidence extant about it. Obviously, I accept the intercession of the saints, and I do believe it's present among some Christians, at least as early as the second century. But again, it's harder to defend just because there's not a whole lot of references to it that early on. Now you start to get into the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. Now you're seeing it, much more explicit and consistent and pervasive. Now you're really starting to see it come up a lot. You do have a reference to, in the martyrdom of Polycarp in the 2nd century, you do have a reference to the distinction between veneration and worship. Because when they were venerating the relics of Polycarp, the writer says that, and he's careful to note, this is not worship. We're not worshiping Polycarp's bones here. That would be a sin against Christ. And so that distinction of veneration and worship of saints is certainly there. It's certainly present. But again, it takes some time for it to kind of get developed in practice.
Not idolatrous, communion, baptism, and more. Through the eras of pagan persecution and heresies, Orthodox Christians remained faithful to the Word of God and compiled the books of the apostles into the New Testament and defended and expounded Christian teachings such as the Trinity and Christ's incarnation against all heresy. All of the ancient Christian creeds, such as the Nicene Creed, were also written by Orthodox Christians.
But that assumes, right? I mean, because we would just say they're written by Catholic Christians. She's going to say they're written by Orthodox Christians. Protestants are going to say these creeds were written by proto-Protestants, So again, it's a blanket assertion rather than an actual apologetic. And maybe that wasn't her intention. Maybe that was the intention. Maybe she wasn't trying to offer an apologetic. And okay, that's fine. My pushback, however, is going to be, but if you believe that Nicaea, created the canon, I'm going to have to start asking questions like, have you really looked into this sufficiently? I'm going to have to respectfully ask that question. And I think the answer is no. And that's going to come out in the comment section that we're going to review here in just a moment.
One lives as an Orthodox Christian by doing as Christ instructed, by denying themselves, taking up their cross, and following Christ. God generously gives his grace, and we try to do our very best to live in love with him.
And this is awesome that she's mentioning this, because she's preaching the truth to these people. I bet some of the people in her viewership aren't Christians, and they're now having an opportunity to hear the transforming power of the gospel. So I appreciate that she's doing this. And I'm happy to see it. I'm encouraged by it. And I'm saying, look, I'm right there with you. Job well done. I'm glad you came to Orthodoxy. I'm glad you're preaching the message of the transforming power of Christ and that you're attesting to that in your own life. I'm glad. I'm happy to hear that. So don't take any of this pushback on Catholicism and issues related to Catholicism or just blanket assertions about Orthodoxy. Don't take that to mean, hey, I don't see what you're doing and I don't commend what you're doing and I don't recognize the transforming power of Christ in your life. I recognize all that.
We believe that to remain faithful to Christ, we must remain faithful to the whole truth and cannot divide his body or change his words, as to do so is to deny Christ's words and those of his apostles.
Boom. Perfect. But I want to hold her to that standard, to embrace his whole truth. I want to hold her to that standard. I'm in agreement. Yes. But I'm going to offer some charitable pushback and say, but some of the positions that she holds to is not the fullness of the truth. And so I agree with that, but I just want to call her to consistency there. Yes, embrace the fullness of Christ's words. But now the question is, what did he reveal? And what is that truth? And how do we discern these things? Do we assume them, or can they actually be identified?
But hey, don't take my word for it. I encourage my audience to do research for yourself into the Orthodox Church and to pray to God for guidance. And I have confidence that you will find the fullness of God's grace within the Orthodox Church. Well, that is my entire testimony. Thank you all so much for...
Excellent. And again, I want to call her to that consistency. Now, in just a second, I want us to look at some of the comments that she and I had on this video. But first, I need to get coffee. Must have coffee. I think I had a coffee mug at one point that said, but first, coffee. But I don't know what happened to it. It probably broke. But give me 2 minutes here to get me a refill, and we will continue. By the way, I see Father is in the chat. He's an Eastern Orthodox priest, and he says, yes, we can objectively figure it out. It definitely looks a little different from Roman Catholics than Roman Catholics are used to. Now, in a sense, I'm going to agree with you. Because when you talk about Roman Catholics, Roman Catholics, even though I don't think that they've deviated from the substance of the apostolic deposit of faith, which is why I'm in communion with the Catholic Church, I would say some of its liturgical practices aren't ideal and are a accidental deviation from apostolic practice in some cases. I understand how they happened historically. I'm again going to go to bat for the Latin Rite and say that they haven't, apostatized from the faith or done something sinful or evil. But I'm going to be there and defending along with you, Father, that maybe some of the liturgical expressions in the Roman Rite aren't the most ideal. And I don't know how. I don't know how they would argue with that. I think that's, some of them would acknowledge that. Some of them would still defend it as the most ideal, like withholding communion from infants, or communion under one kind. It's legitimate, but is it the most ideal expression of the apostolic liturgy? Probably not. Now, obviously, they've restored the chalice to the laity in the Roman Rite since the Second Vatican Council, and so it's becoming a non-issue. But so when you say it looks different than Roman Catholics are used, it's definitely going to look different. But we could say the same thing about the Byzantine liturgy, right? I mean, there's some aspects of the Byzantine liturgy that's going to look different than to the apostles. They weren't venerating icons. They didn't have an iconostasis. If one of the apostles walked into our churches, they're going to see some differences. So even in the Byzantine liturgy, we have our own set of developments and even liturgical innovations. But when I say innovation, I don't mean it in the sense that it's illegitimate. I think that they're legitimate. So anyways, I appreciate you there in the chat. He said, I'm glad Michael is doing a reaction to this video. It's been going around. I always enjoy Michael's perspective. I didn't know it's been going around. I mean, I knew it went into my feed, but I didn't know if others were seeing it or if it was circulated or something like that. But anyways, before we continue, I need my coffee. And Father also says, great points, Michael. It was great to hear your thoughts and wisdom. I'd love to have you back on the show, by the way, Father. Love to have you back on the show. What was the name of the show we did, by the way, so that y'all can go check it out? Let me find it here. Let me quickly find it. Let's see. Okay. Well, second. Pulling it up here, y'all. Hang tight. Well, this always happens. Every time I'm trying to find a video, it doesn't come up. I'm checking, y'all, because I do want y'all to go and see the discussion. It was very profitable. Let me just type in Father Alexis Baldwin and see what comes up. There it is. The Orthodox Church in America on Sexuality with Father Alexis Baldwin. That was a really fun discussion that we had. And then also a mission priest's perspective on reunion with Father Alexis Baldwin. We had some good discussions in both of those videos. And Father Alexis is OCA missionary in Mississippi. So, by the way, Father, you need to come and we need to do a video in person because I have you can't see it, it's off camera, but I have it set up to where we can do something in person. So for in-person guests. So let me know when you're in the area and we'll do it. All right. Give me 1 second. I'm going to grab some coffee and then we'll continue with the video. All right, I am back here. So let's just go over conversation that we had here in the comment section that I think is enlightening. And I think it also serves to give us a few points of consideration whenever we're just converting to a community in general. So I think that this would actually also apply to recent converts to Catholicism or something like that. Okay. So I don't think this is just applicable to converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. All right, let me share my screen and make it larger there. Oh, I missed the super chat. Hold on. Let me see what it is. Let me go to it before we continue. Okay, Sean, was it Sean Matthew? Okay, yeah, it was. All right. So can the Orthodox objectively figure out what they are obligated to believe through their ordinary and universal magisterium? Okay, so this is a good question. First of all, they're not going to call it that. But is there an analogous concept in Eastern Orthodoxy? Somewhat. Not exactly. Because obviously we're going to say the ordinary and universal magisterium is the College of Bishops, and the College of Bishops includes the Pope. It can never not include the Pope. Otherwise, it's not the College of Bishops. So clearly, we're going to define the ordinary and universal magisterium conceptually differently than they do. But I guess you're asking, like, do they have the equivalent of an ordinary and universal magisterium minus the Pope? So, like, their version of the College of Bishops, perhaps, collectively all of the synods of bishops, and the bishops throughout the ages. There is somewhat of a concept like that. Again, they're not going to call it ordinary and universal magisterium. They tend to shy away from the term magisterium itself. But is there an analogous concept there? Somewhat. They're going to appeal to the constant tradition or appeal to the teaching of the bishops throughout the ages. So in that sense, there's an analogy of ordinary and universal magisterium, but the problem is it begs the question, how do I identify that thing objectively? I can identify it objectively in Catholicism because I defined it as the College of Bishops in union with the successor of Peter, the Bishop of Rome. That gives more objectivity to it. But when you just say the constant teaching of the bishops, which bishops? I mean, the Oriental Orthodox. I mean, are we including them? The Syrian Church of the East? Do we include them in this category of constant teaching of bishops? Clearly not. They're going to say no. But isn't that arbitrary? Isn't that already assuming what we're trying to establish here? If we're trying to establish what is orthodoxy, we've already assumed what orthodoxy is by excluding the Oriental Orthodox and Assyrian Church of the East. So I need something, an objective way to identify this concept of the constant teaching of the bishops or something like that, or the teachings of the councils. Which councils? Ephesus 2? They're going to say no. Okay, why? On what basis do I discard Ephesus 2? Well, it's not consistent with the tradition. Okay, but I thought I was trying to determine what the tradition is. I thought I'm supposed to look at ecumenical councils as witness to the tradition. Well, it's one of the witnesses of tradition, but you also have, the teaching of the local bishop, right? But some of the teachings of the local bishops could be heretical. Well, you also have the synods of bishops, right? But some of the synods of bishops could be in heresy, and some of them say conflicting things. And so, but you also have the enlightenment that comes immediately to you through divinization and God enlightening your nous, right? Yeah, but there's been a whole lot of Orthodox who tried to use that, or especially Orthodox monks who tried to use that argument to speak against the bishops. So, and against their teachings, what do we do there? And obviously, I could think that I have the divine energies flowing through me, enlightening my nous, and I could be wrong. And how does that differ from a Protestant who says the Holy Spirit has enlightened me and personally told to me which books are canonical and which aren't? And your Deuterocanon isn't canonical. Which, it was interesting that we heard earlier, a blanket assertion of the canon. I don't know if Jasmyne is aware of it, but there is a dispute on the canon of Scripture in Eastern Orthodoxy. There is no one canon. There is a dispute on the Deuterocanonicals and their level of authority. So you'll see some who are very hesitant to say that the Deuterocanonicals are inspired by God. So they might speak of them as canonical, and in some cases they'll say they're not canonical, but you have to ask, okay, well, what do you mean by canonical? But you'll notice it's conspicuous that some Orthodox will not use the term inspiration for them. And so we're asking the question, are they canonical in the sense of inspired Scripture? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. Is there any objectively identifiable settlement of the canon? No, because in Orthodoxy, there hasn't been a definitive judgment on the canon. You could maybe appeal to Jerusalem 1672, but all an Orthodox has to do, and some of them do at this point, is just say, well, that was overly Latin in expression council, and we haven't received every bit of it, as Kallistos Ware noted in his works. Not all of it has been received. Okay, well, what part has and hasn't been received? And so you'll see clearly there's not a universal reception and acceptance of 1672, at least not presently. There was, at least at the time of 1672, but not necessarily today. So even that appeal kind of falls short, and there are Orthodox who give pushback there. So it's not this, knockout argument that says, see, Orthodoxy has a established canon. Not exactly. Okay. Make sure I didn't miss any other super chats before we continue here. Let's see. Okay. I think I grabbed them all. All right. Somebody's saying Jerusalem 1672 is something you have to accept as Orthodox, not according to Kallistos Ware and a few others. They're going to say not all of 1672 has been received. Go and read Kallistos Ware again. And again, he's not the only one who's saying it. They're going to say some parts of 1672 have to be received and some parts haven't been received. And so when you say it has to be accepted, that's not exactly true. Parts of it maybe need to be. But then when you start asking an Orthodox questions like, well, what part needs to be accepted of 1672 and what part doesn't, then you start to get into really subjective answers where there isn't really an objective answer to that. You're going to get different answers. And I'm going to say, well, okay, all right, well, I can ask Catholics questions and I'll get different answers. But the difference between us at this point is I can still point you to an objectively identifiable answer through the magisterium. But I can't do that with Orthodoxy. Okay. So let's do a share screen. Somebody saying sounds like Orthodox is a bit all over the place, but in the fairness to the Orthodox, wasn't the early church? In fairness to the Orthodox, was it the early church? You find the early church all over the place, right? Did you have a settled canon in the early church? Not exactly. So in that sense, they're not a whole lot different than the early church here. My problem is with that is it's excusable that the early church was kind of all over the place because they're the early church. After 2,000 years, we should be more grown up than the early church. We should have settled through some of these issues. We shouldn't be disputing still whether or not to receive converts through rebaptism. I thought that was already settled in the middle of the 3rd century. What are we doing? Still having this discussion in Orthodoxy? It just shouldn't. But anyways, we shouldn't say, well, because the early church in its infantile, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, in its infant state, was all over the place, that means somehow that we today should be. No, after a certain point in time, you should grow up, you should mature in the faith, and we've had a whole lot of more additional time to think and deal with these issues than the early church did. So there should be some progress by 2,000 years later. So again, in fairness to the Orthodox, the early church was a lot like that, but also in response to that, but we shouldn't stay in that state. Now, we didn't have a solemn definition on the canon until arguably Florence or Trent, right? Certainly Trent, but maybe even arguably Florence. So we go quite a long time without a solemn definition, but in fairness to the Catholics, we didn't really need a solemn definition since those local councils of Hippo, Carthage, and Rome were kind of enough to settle the issue. So we didn't really need that kind of universal judgment since the local conciliar judgments was sufficient. But by the time that you have Cajetan and others, and especially Luther, starting to dispute the canonicity of certain books, then it became necessary to offer a solemn definition. But Orthodox also have Protestants claiming their canon is not fully correct, and so have the Orthodox been able to respond to that? Well, they tried to in 1672, but as I've already shown, but there isn't a universal perception of 1672, at least not in all of its parts in Orthodoxy. So have they really settled the issue in the way that the Council of Trent has? No. So is Orthodoxy even capable of responding to the Protestant errors in the way that Catholics have? I want to say no. They're not in the way that Catholics have, because they lack that objectively identifiable way to have a universal magisterium, and whenever those judgments are issues, to require the assent of everyone. In Orthodoxy, they're going to tend to say, well, we're not required to assent to an ecumenical council whenever we've somehow identified it, until it's been received. Well, that could be hundreds of years from now before it's received. And what do we mean by received? Received by whom? All of the Synod of Bishops? Part of the Synod of Bishops? There's nothing really objective there at the end of the day. So I don't think that they could respond to the Protestant errors in the way that Catholics have. But anyways, I digress. Let's get back into the comment section here. Although that excursion there, I think was still helpful for us to address. Okay. So I said, as an Orthodox in communion with Rome, I encourage you to look further into Eastern Catholicism. I know that's going to set off a lot of Orthodox. How dare you call yourself Orthodox? You're not Orthodox. You're a Uniate. I know, which is deliberately why I use that term, because I know it's provocative. But I do believe that's true. I do believe that the Eastern Catholic Churches are Orthodox in communion with Rome. And I will defend the thesis that to be Orthodox means to preserve Catholic communion with the Pope. Now, obviously, the Eastern Orthodox are going to disagree there. Clearly, we're going to have a difference there. But that's my thesis. Otherwise, I wouldn't be an Eastern Catholic. I wouldn't waste my time with Catholicism if I didn't believe that were true. But I just, encouraged her to look into Eastern Catholicism. She says, respectfully, I simply don't believe the papacy is a holy institution at all. Okay. Well, I said, I understand. I used to be an Eastern Orthodox. But the Third Ecumenical Council, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and the Seventh Ecumenical Councils all refer to the papacy as established by Christ, which makes it a holy institution. Because if you have an institution established by Christ, how could it be anything but holy, right? If it's established by Christ, it's a holy institution. Especially if he's promising to preserve that institution until the end of the age. If that's the case, which he certainly did do in the Gospels, then he has to preserve it as holy. Because if he preserves it, but it's no longer holy, then it's lost one of its essential features. So to appeal to the fact that these ecumenical councils refer to the papacy as a divinely established institution, is to necessitate the position that it's also a holy institution. So my point is, well, look, if you believe the ecumenical councils, I don't know how you could actually say that. So I said it's in the DNA of Orthodoxy to kind of use the term of Eric Ibarra. I love Eric Ibarra's phrases, by the way. He has like the best phrases everywhere. The DNA of Orthodoxy. I think what was another one of him? Within the cones of Orthodoxy. I love that one. He had another one. I'm trying to think of what it was that I really enjoyed, but I'm drawing a blank on it. But I always envy people who can come up with these kinds of terms. Another one who does it is Timothy Gordon. He comes up with some of these expressions and terms that, for me, I find it challenging to use some of these expressions and terms and to come up with these kinds of expressions. I tend to be just kind of literalistic and rigid in my thinking, so I don't always come up with these kinds of analogous expressions and stuff like that. So I always envy somebody whenever they have a way with words. Anyways, even Mark of Ephesus wouldn't dispute that, right? Because is Mark of Ephesus going to dispute that the papacy is a divinely established institution? I don't think he would. But what he is going to dispute is whether or not that institution entails papal infallibility, universal jurisdiction, that kind of stuff. But I don't think Mark of Ephesus is going to deny that you have a institution in the person of Peter, and that would continue in successors, and that Peter is in a sense a unique successor to Saint. The Pope is a unique successor in a sense to Saint Peter. Although there's of course still a general sense in which every bishop is a successor to Saint Peter, which obviously Mark of Ephesus would affirm, but we as Catholics would also affirm. So the question is, what is the role of the divine institution, not whether it was divinely instituted. So I think that really we can agree that the papacy is a divine institution. The question is, what exactly is that role? That's where really the dispute is between Catholic and Orthodox. By the way, I see that I don't think it's directed to me. But I think it's helpful to consider what Father is saying here. There's a final arbiter for sure, like Michael explained through, forgive my poor summarization, our Orthodox system is decentralized. Yeah, and look, in fairness to the Eastern Orthodox, it could be that that's how Christ established it, right? Just because we as Catholics have a central point of authority doesn't mean that is automatically an argument against Orthodoxy, because even the Mormons have a centralized point of authority. So it could be that Christ established the church in a way that is modeled as the Orthodox have it, in a kind of more decentralized way. That could be how Christ established it. So the question is going to be, what did Christ establish? Did he give us this model that is more centralized? Or did he give us more of a decentralized model? Now, we all agree that there's features that are centralized and decentralized. We all agree, Catholics and Orthodox, we can speak of central. We can speak of a centralization of the role of the bishop in his own diocese, for example. But the question is, on the universal level, is it decentralized or is it centralized? Is it kind of a combination of both? what did Christ establish there and intend for his church on the universal level? That's where the debate is. And in fairness to the Orthodox, there is the more orthodox model in ecclesiology on the universal level is present in the first millennium. It's there. It is there. But in fairness to the Catholic position, I want to also say the Catholic model is also present in the first millennium. I want to say you have both of these models in the first millennium, and they're conflicting with each other on various occasions, and they're competing with each other on various occasions. So both Catholics and Orthodox can appeal to the first millennium for their respective models. So then we have to get further into the question of, okay, well, how do I know which is the correct model and which one isn't? But yeah, I appreciate Father's comments here. Let's see. Yeah, there are some Father says there are some Orthodox that are more open to something, or that are open to something more centralized, like the papacy. Right. But even then, like the ones that are open to it, how does that work practically? Can the Pope really interfere in the affairs of the territory of another bishop? What does that look like practically? That's where the real debate is. And I want to concede some genuine criticisms to the Orthodox and saying, look, the Pope shouldn't just be this Rambo Pope doing everything, in everyone's territory. I don't think that that's what Vatican I is teaching. But I think what Vatican I is teaching and what the intention of Christ and his institution is trying to safeguard is the ability of the Pope to be able to intervene in the territory of a local bishop, because otherwise you just could have a bishop do anything. The rejoinder to that could be, well, what about the Bishop of Rome? What if you have the Bishop of Rome doing crazy things? Who can intervene in his territory, right? So it brings us into a further discussion there. Back to the comment section here. So she says, or I continue to say, the question is, what is the role of the divine institution, not whether it was divinely instituted? Also, when you were received into Orthodoxy, I mean, depending on which communion she was received in, you probably made a profession in upholding these councils. So I hope you consider the above. So I don't know what jurisdiction she went into. I haven't looked into any of that. I haven't tried to do any research, but even if she didn't have to make a formal profession in the 7 ecumenical councils, that's still expected of her as an Eastern Orthodox. Like, you're not free to dismiss the 7 ecumenical councils as an Eastern Orthodox, regardless of the jurisdiction you're in. That's pretty established. I said, if you want to chat more, we could certainly have a charitable discussion on either of our channels. I've had Kallistos Ware and many other Orthodox on the show, so I'm always willing to have a charitable interaction with others. Okay. Let's see. So she says, I love Kallistos Ware. Amazing. The scripture used to biblically substantiate the papacy comes from Matthew 16. Yes. Well, among multiple others. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. The Orthodox position is that Christ was referring to Peter's confession of faith when Peter said, thou art Peter, the Son of the living God, not Peter himself. So here we have the use of a Protestant argument against Catholicism that's not native really to Orthodoxy in my estimation. Now you might find some figures in Orthodoxy preceding the Reformation that kind of use a version of this, but whenever they did so, I think that was foreign to the Orthodox tradition. I think the Orthodox have been pretty consistent that, yeah, Peter is the head of the apostles. There's a leadership established there. And so I don't think that historically the Orthodox would really have a major problem saying that Peter himself was the rock. I certainly think that that's in, again, to use the phrase, DNA of Orthodoxy. But what does that mean? What does that entail? What are the implications of that? That's where we get into a debate. But to kind of use this Protestant argument, I find it to be just that. I find it to be, here's a case where you have an Orthodox convert using a Protestant argument against Catholicism. I find that very, very common among converts to Orthodoxy. and they're usually Protestant converts. In her case, I don't know if she was ever a Protestant, but I find it very common. And so even if she wasn't a Protestant, she was probably catechized by somebody who was a Protestant convert, or somebody who got their information from them. Okay, what are your thoughts here? She asked me. Also, your thoughts on how scandalous this current pope is and past popes. Taylor Marshall, is that you writing this comment? The current pope promotes actual Mother Earth worship, paganism, if you look up Pachamama Vatican. Also, the Pope prays Islamic prayers with Muslim clerics. I'm, of course, not saying the validity of Catholicism hinges on the Pope's behavior, but I'd say the Pope's behavior is a reflection of how removed the Catholic Church is from grace. So multiple things going on here, but this is why, Rad Trads, if y'all are watching, this is why I've been telling y'all, please be consistent. Please be consistent, because Orthodox are watching you and they're using your arguments against you. As I've been saying over and over and over, pay attention. Consider whenever you open your mouth and use these arguments against the Pope, ask yourself this question: can an Orthodox use this against me to undermine my own view? And if not, why not? Just be prepared to answer that question is all I'm saying. I'm not saying you could not offer an answer, but I'm saying just be prepared to offer that answer, because I think many aren't. It's not on their radar. Okay, so I wrote back, yes, I'm sad Ware passed away. He was my priest confessor. Ware also was very strong on unifying Orthodox and Catholics, so I think we lost a really valuable figure. I'm curious if you like Ware, then I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about his view that we may hope all will be saved. It's not unique to him, but is very popular today in large parts of Orthodoxy. Because I'm getting a very exclusive impression from her. This an idea of salvation is incredibly exclusive to the canonical bounds of Orthodoxy. I'm picking up on that here. So if she, you know, likes Ware, she says, I love Ware, I think it's legitimate for me to ask, well, what do you think about his view there? I mean, Kallistos Ware maintained and defended the view that we can have a hope that all will be saved. You know, kind of that Balthasar position. I'm not commenting on that position specifically. I'm just saying, how does that kind of work out with this kind of more exclusive view of Orthodoxy, that impression that you know one is giving here? So how does that work? Do you just think that maybe Ware was unorthodox there? How does that work? Okay. Said, thank you for the questions. The claim that the confession is what Jesus referred to as not the historical Orthodox view, but is a Protestant argument used by former Protestants who converted to Orthodoxy and carried with them their Protestant objections. Now, again, I do think that you can find some figures preceding the Reformation in the East that would use a type of this argument, but again, I don't think that was consistently the position of Orthodoxy. I think in those cases, they're actually deviating from a more established position of the East. Not only is there plenty of church fathers that speak of Peter being the rock, but again, this isn't really what is in dispute historically between Orthodox and Catholics, as the Eastern Orthodox churches of the Byzantine Empire didn't have a problem acknowledging Peter as the rock. I notice you said the Orthodox position is, but I would say not only was what you noted not the historical position of Orthodoxy, but that there is rarely an Orthodox position for anything. Yeah, I mean, in fairness here. It's more often the case that it is more appropriate to say one of the Orthodox views is, since the Orthodox churches haven't been able to settle any theological disputes after the last emperor. It was historically the emperor that called the shots among the Eastern churches of the empire and dictated what they were to believe. For example, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, where you do have the emperor dictating effectively what the council fathers are to accept. There was no debate. There was no debate that took place at the Fifth Council. The fathers weren't sitting there debating theology. They're basically said, here's what, they're told, here's what you have to accept, and that's it. Okay. And again, I hold to the Fifth Ecumenical Council, so I'm not saying that's a defeater for either Catholics or Orthodox, but it is noteworthy. At the end of Constantinople, this ceased, but along with it ceased the ability of the Eastern Orthodox churches to settle issues, definitively speaking. I'd be happy to provide you with numerous patristic and also Orthodox sources that confirm what I've said about Peter being the rock. So I tell her I can give you plenty of sources here. Pay attention to that. Note that. In the meantime, take a look at my Eastern Orthodox playlist or papacy playlist on my channel. So in the meantime, I already gave her another source. There's plenty of videos that I've done on this topic. And in those videos, I give all kinds of references. As far as the Pachamama issue, I did a show on this, but in short, if you watch the video, you'll see them call the image Our Lady of the Amazon, which is a reference to Mary, and commence the seething among all the rad trads right now. If you ask me, it is in poor taste and bad optics, but it was not pagan or idolatry. There are plenty of examples where Orthodox have taken pagan elements and baptized them into Christianity. I mean, this is kind of undeniable, right? Both East and West do this. By the way, that's the kind of argument, the one that she's using against Catholicism, that's the one that Protestants tend to use against Eastern Orthodox. So I'm just saying there's a little bit of irony here. Both East and West do this, so it shouldn't be a source of division between us. I personally think it was imprudent of the Pope to do this because it gave people the appearance of idolatry. Orthodox have the same problem here as icon veneration, which I defend, gives the appearance of idolatry to the average person, and that's true. Does it not? What's the one thing a Protestant is going to say if they walk into an Orthodox church? What's the first thing they're going to say? They're going to say, well, it looks like you're worshiping idols here, right? I know all the Orthodox who are watching this can testify. Yeah, that's going to be the first thing they're going to say. Is it idolatry? Obviously not. I accept it. But I'm just saying it gives that appearance in the same way that what is taking place here in the Vatican Gardens gives that appearance, and so it's imprudent. Does that mean it's imprudent to venerate icons, however? No. So there's not a full, one-to-one correlation there. I'm going to defend the veneration of icons, but if our objection is just, well, this thing looks bad, then, all right. As far as the Pope praying with Muslims, I don't think it's right, but I should point out there are usually Orthodox bishops right there with the Pope joining in with him. It is true. This is why Patriarch Bart has no problem with Pope Francis and is clearly on Team Francis and everything. So if you critique the Pope for this, be sure to do the same with the bishops your bishop is probably in communion with. I don't know who her bishop is. Maybe he's not in the communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople. But her bishop is in communion with somebody who's in communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople. That means something. You're in communion with those who are in communion with him, at the very least. What does that say about you? And what does that mean for you? I think it goes too far to say Catholics are removed from grace. That certainly is not the historical stance Orthodox have taken about Catholics. I know it's kind of popular today among some Orthodox, but I don't think that's really historically the case, at least when it comes to the grace of the sacraments. But she didn't specify sacraments there, so I'm not exactly sure how to take what she said. I get the impression you joined the church through Rokor, or one of the Slavic churches, by your objection. Did I get that right? They tend to be the more exclusive ones compared to the Greek and Antiochians, who are much more open to salvation outside of Orthodoxy. Although that's just a tendency, right? You can find people that are in Rokor or some of the other churches that derived from the Russian tradition who are more open and don't necessarily agree with her. And then you can find some in Greek Orthodoxy that are pretty exclusive. And so I'm just painting with a broad brush here. Broad brush. So I'm not saying that this is descriptive of everybody. But I said in the case of Elpidophoros, even outside of Christianity, which is interesting because Elpidophoros, of course, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in America, had some interesting comments less than a year ago where he's clearly talking about universalism. It seems that he affirms that there's salvation, not that there's salvation outside the formal bounds of Orthodoxy or there's salvation only in Christ. It sure seems like he was just teaching universalism. I think I did a show on that a while back. All right, if you have any other questions, feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to answer any of your concerns you may have about what is said or Catholicism in general. And she just says, Christ was referring to a mere creature rather than himself for the foundation of the church. Source, trust me, bro. That was her response. I was very disappointed with that. For two reasons. Number one, that was a caricature of my position. That's not even my position itself. And then number two, I feel like, you know, at that point, we're kind of turning into mockery and being uncharitable, rather than really engaging what was said. And so I kind of feel like, well, you know, we're going to take it that direction. There's not a whole lot more that can be said. So I don't expect to really reach Jasmine at this time. Maybe I've planted a seed, but I don't really expect to reach her at this time. But I do hope that through the use of this video, it will speak to other recent converts to Orthodoxy and maybe get them thinking, or even converts to Catholicism. And the point is to show that, you know what, if you're a new convert to the Catholic Church, just try to not be so dogmatic in everything that you assert, because there's probably a whole lot that you haven't considered yet. So if you're a recent convert to Catholicism, don't start anathematizing the Orthodox. Calm down. We don't need more cage stage Catholics. Calm down. Stop anathematizing the Orthodox, and maybe just take some time, you know, and really consider the Catholic position historically, and that'll tone down some of that rhetoric. Let's see. Okay. The response that I offered was, is your bishop the head of the local church? As an Orthodox, you have to say yes, but isn't Jesus the head of the local church? Yes, both are true. This overly simplistic Protestant thinking isn't very convincing. Is Jesus the head of the church? Yes, but the Council of Ephesus said that you're to uphold as that you are to uphold as an Orthodox Christian. Said the Bishop of Rome is head. What do you do there? You're supposed to uphold the Council of Ephesus, and it's saying the Bishop of Rome is head. Does that mean you don't believe Jesus is the head of the church? And it's, by the way, talking about headship on the universal level. So you can't make a distinction like, well, he's the head of the local territory of Rome. No. It's talking about universal. Head to members is specifically what he's talking about. So the difference is between a visible versus invisible head, or a primary analog versus secondary analog. And this is an area where I think a lot of Protestants are deficient, so that they think that some of the prayers that we have to Mary detracts from Jesus. It's because they're lacking an understanding of primary versus secondary analog. Also, you didn't engage anything I said and that is conspicuous, as I don't think you've looked into any of this before, but you make sweeping claims like the Orthodox position is. So in other words, I was trying to show her in a very nice way. Maybe be a little less assertive of what Orthodoxy is, and maybe you know, start to consider some of the pushback that can be offered. Because if that's not done, what's unfortunate is if she starts studying Orthodoxy further, starts reading church history, she's going to come across things that conflict with what she's been told. And at that point, she might, you know, say, you know what, I've been sold a bill of goods and leave Eastern Orthodoxy. And I want to say, but wait, that's actually not a really good reason to leave Eastern Orthodoxy. What it is you just need to ask questions like, okay, well, can I modify the position? And what I was told, yeah, may have been, you know, may have been not entirely true, but is it still possible to maintain Eastern Orthodoxy in light of this information? And so it's important to consider those kinds of questions, because it could just lead to a person saying, I've been sold a bill of goods, I'm leaving Christianity. And maybe that's why she's feeling a little threatened right now, because I can definitely tell by kind of resorting to this kind of immature tactic. She's probably, the reason why the claws are coming out is because she's probably feeling a little uneasy, because now she's starting to see, well, wait, some of the reasons why I converted to Orthodoxy are being challenged. Does that mean I made the wrong decision? And whenever a person starts to ask that question, it shakes their faith. It stirs them up. It shakes their faith. And what I'm trying to do is not necessarily make her abandon Orthodoxy. I'm trying to ask the question, does Orthodoxy necessitate Catholic communion? So for those who are Eastern Catholic, I think that they are Orthodox. I just think they're Orthodox in communion with Rome. So I don't think when you go from Eastern Orthodoxy to Eastern Catholicism, I don't think you've left anything or abandoned anything. I think you've gained something. The question is that which you've gained, is that actually something that Christ is calling you to and something he established? But let's see. I said I gave you references and even said I would be happy to give you more, and you strawmanned my position and my words as saying, "Trust me, bro. This kind of uncharitable behavior shows me you aren't open to new information, so I'll bow out. When you can evaluate these things objectively, come visit my channel and we'll discuss further. God bless you." So, again, I don't expect to reach her, at least at this time, but I do hope that by going over this scenario, I can demonstrate to other recent converts that we should be a tad bit more mitigated in our claims, right? We're all guilty of this. I know I was an overly zealous convert, very overly zealous. But that zeal has to be tempered with knowledge, and of course with charity as well. And that's something that's still ongoing for me, working on, being charitable and stuff like that. So that's still ongoing for me, but it's certainly something that new converts really need to be aware of, because they're often going to be, more, they're going to be ignorance on fire, as it's called. Ignorance on fire. Full of zeal, full of passion, very little, knowledge on the subject. And this is for not just Orthodox converts. This is Catholic converts too. Catholic converts. This is also, Protestants who go from Arminianism to Calvinism, Calvinist converts, the cage stage. This is a phenomenon for everyone. It's not one communion, because it's a human phenomenon. It's a human tendency. Let's see something about Father here. Michael, it's unfortunate that the exchange wasn't more amicable. Hopefully she'll come around on your show. You made some great points about being irenic. Hopefully folks will hear them. I appreciate that, Father. Thank you. And, I know none of these are knocked down arguments against Orthodoxy, because I think that a strong case can be offered by the Orthodox in response to all this. So much more can be said. Let's see. Look through the chat. Are there any questions, by the way? If so, go ahead and put them to @Reason in Theology. I'm going to do another show later on talking about John Henry Newman and his view on the magisterium. I think it'll be helpful. Let's see. Michael says, yes, she definitely needs to read some more. It might help if she starts watching your show. Yeah, I mean, all you could do is plant a seed, and perhaps it'll get a person thinking more later. That happened with me many times. I mean, there was plenty of times, I wasn't fully ready to hear something, and but I continued to ruminate over it, and over time I considered it further. So not everybody is always ready to hear certain things, especially somebody who is like just converted or whatever. Somebody who's just converted doesn't want to hear anything that's challenging to what they convert to. So that's going to make them feel very uncomfortable, because they're going to feel like, well, what, did I make the wrong decision? And I'm not even saying she made the wrong decision. I actually think that, relatively speaking, it's the right decision to go from paganism to Orthodoxy. But then still the question remains, should one come into communion with the Bishop of Rome? And I could say remotely God calls everyone to that, but proximately, is that necessary for everyone's salvation? I did a video, like I said, just a few days ago, where I responded to Joshua Shuping on this question, and it's not as clear cut as you might think, Catholic who's watching this. It's not as clear cut. Please don't quote unum sanctum to me. I already addressed that in the video too. Don't think that, well, unless you become a formal member of the Catholic Church, you're going to hell. It's not that clear. That is not the position of the Church. That's not even a proper understanding of unum sanctum or the Council of Florence or something like that. So, Okay. Let's see here. Looking through the chat. Were there any questions? If not, I'm going to kill the stream. Okay, here's something from just some vids. Well, actually, there was a preceding question by George. Have you done a show on the Russian converts to Catholicism in the 19th and 20th centuries? It's a fascinating topic, and they make interesting arguments against the Russian Orthodox Church. I have not. I'd be willing to, but I haven't. Before popes infallibly canonized saints, is it still infallible that the saints from the first millennium is in heaven through the ordinary and universal magisterium due to things like their feast days being celebrated throughout the churches? Yeah. So look, whenever you have these non papal canonizations, the reason why I'm going to say that those are irreformable is because you do have this element of reception of the churches. I'm going to qualify that here in a second, but that's to concede to the Orthodox that there is an element of reception in the church. Reception is not absolutely opposed to Catholic ecclesiology and teaching authority. There is some truth to the concept of reception. It's just that reception is not the ultimate standard, right? It's not the ultimate indicator. It's definitely not the only indicator of what is universally binding. It's a way to determine what is universally binding, but it is not the ultimate way, because ultimately it's going to beg the question, where is the church? So you're going to have some kind of other objective standard to then locate this reception within. Reception by whom? So if you have a universal reception of, let's say, St. Jerome, I think that we could comfortably say there's universal reception of his veneration. I don't have a problem saying that's irreformable. But what about, like, you have reception of just this local saint, and the other churches don't, haven't received that person, like Alexis Toth or something like that? I don't think that that's irreformable, because that's reception among the local a local church. That counts for something. It counts for something. I'm not dismissing reception among a local church, but what I'm saying is that irreformable? No. I would say irreformability only applies to universal reception. How does that work in relation to, Eastern Catholics venerating Gregory Palamas and stuff like that? Is that reformable? I would say no, because the universal organ has examined it, and that is the Pope. Let's see. Looking through the chat here. When will I do a show responding to Seraphim Rowe's arguments against Catholicism? I want to do so. I mean, didn't he have like comments where he's speaking about the Catholic Church as like the Church of the Antichrist? And was it he who was speaking about how some of our saints were under demonic deception and things like that? I'd have to go back and double check that, but I think that that's worth addressing, because I think that that's just way off base. That's not to say that I don't think that God was at work in his life. I certainly think so, given the lifestyle that he repented of and transformed from. So, and he also had some really good works and good things to say. But I think he was way off base on that one. And I think that's incredibly rash to start saying like our saints are under demonic deception. I don't remember for sure if he was the one who said that, but I'm pretty confident I think he did say some things like that. But correct me if I'm wrong. If I've misrepresented him, please forgive me. Angel says, isn't the issue just people who haven't studied a topic properly deciding to teach on it? I feel like that applies to all topics. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an element here. What happens is with recent converts, converts are often unaware of their own limitations and of how ignorant they might be. We're all guilty of that. Those of us who are converts, whenever we converted, we didn't know how ignorant we were. We might not even know how ignorant we are now, but we have a better idea of it now than when we converted, right? So that's again a problem that we see with everyone. You know, when somebody recently converts, they think they got all the answers, and in the vast majority of cases, they haven't really considered some important elements. That was certainly the case for me when I converted to Catholicism. So I had to start to work through things later on and do maintenance to some of the conclusions that I came to. And so obviously I still hold the Catholic Church being the fullness of the faith. So I think I still get to the same point, like the same result, but I get there through a different series of arguments than the ones I initially accepted. Let's see. Look up Haec Sancta and Great Western Schism sometime. Oh, well, I don't know who that's addressed to, but I've done multiple shows on Haec Sancta, and so ultimately I don't think these are strong arguments against the Catholic Church if that's why it's being brought up. Like I said, Haec Sancta we can deal with in multiple ways. Number one, you could just say that this is non-definitive teaching and that's been reversed, or number two, you could limit it to cases of emergency. You know, the ecclesiology that it's justifying. You could say in cases of emergency, when it's hard to identify who the Pope is, you could appeal to this ecclesiology that they're speaking of, and I don't think that does violence to Vatican I and its ecclesiology. And I don't think that that's conciliarism as condemned by Vatican I. So for me, again, Haec Sancta, regardless of the way the thing shakes down, it's not something that would falsify the Catholic claims in my estimation. Thoughts on marijuana, recreational marijuana. Is it moral to smoke it? Is it okay to support its legislation? I think that, you know, when it comes to taking something that would alter your sobriety, that's not good. Paul talks about be sober and be sober at all times. So I'm opposed to those things that would alter our sobriety, unless it's like a case of necessity for a medical reason. But you said recreational, not medical, so that wouldn't apply here. So I'm not in favor of those things, because I think that violates the imperative that Paul gives us. As far as legislation, I would be opposed to it. Does that then mean that I'm opposed to, you know, alcohol or something like that? No, because I think that you could consume alcohol without altering your sobriety. But the question is, can you smoke marijuana without altering your sobriety? I don't think that's possible. I don't think there's really degrees there. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe somebody's able to smoke marijuana and it doesn't alter their sobriety, but there might be some other problems involved that we could offer there. Saw the comment you left on Denlinger's video. Very funny. Father Brown, if you're watching, you'll be proud of me. So I went to Bryan Denlinger. This is the only time I've ever trolled somebody. I've never really like trolled somebody like this, but what I did here. So Bryan Denlinger is that, you know, I can't even call him Protestant. He doesn't believe in the Trinity, so I don't know what I would classify him as, but he's KJV only guy who's non-Trinitarian, and is always talking about the Catholic Church and railing against it. And one of his big things is that, you know, everyone's a Jesuit. You know, he has these huge conspiracy theories against Jesuits. So I trolled him. I went to his most recent video and I left a comment saying, "Bryan, we are watching you. Signed, the Jesuits." We're watching you. You'll soon be approached by a man. I didn't add that, but I should have. Father Baldwin says, St. Gregory Palamas for the Catholic Church, Doctor 2022. You know what? That isn't far from the truth, right? that would be, we've made a doctor of the church, Gregory of Narek, who wasn't even in communion with the Catholic Church. So, so why not Gregory follow us, right? I'm right there with you. Why not? Let's see. Two connected questions. Can catechumens be in a state of grace through baptism of desire while still alive? Yeah. That's the idea of a baptism of desire, right? Or is baptism of desire only applied to their soul if they were dead? Well, it's definitely not applied to their soul after death. It would need to be applied prior to death for them not to be separated from God. Now there is debate about post-mortem application of grace and stuff like that. I understand that there's a debate there, but I don't necessarily want to get into that whole issue at this moment. There's just so much to consider. But there is something to be said about an application of grace post-mortem. And that doesn't, by the way, assume post-mortem repentance. That's a whole nother issue. Have I heard of David Aaron? Doesn't ring a bell. If they are in a state of grace while still alive, does that mean the stain of original sin was already removed before their baptism, or how could they be in a state of grace? Certainly, yeah. Now, obviously, even with baptism, some of the effects of original sin isn't removed, but we still deal with concupiscence, for example. So the same is going to apply to them. It's the same amount of the same kind. Well, let me rephrase that one. The same transforming power of grace that we receive in baptism, they would have. Do we call that sacramental grace? No, but it's the same transforming power. What else we have here? I see Father mentions Gregory of Narek. Yeah, he mentions my point there. Yeah, why? If we did Gregory of Narek, why not Gregory Paulus? I'm in agreement with you there, Father. And I agree, he is a bridge between East and West in some areas. I agree with you on that one. Not all Eastern Catholics do. My Eastern Catholic friend does not venerate him. Right, there's some Eastern Catholic churches that don't venerate Gregory Palamas because they're not Byzantine. But usually I think those in the Byzantine tradition do, but I haven't verified everyone in the Byzantine tradition, but the non-Byzantine ones don't. But then they're going to venerate some other figures that the Byzantines are not going to venerate, and that creates some more discussions. Giga Sniper says more like at trolling in theology. I don't usually troll somebody, but I had to do it there. It just felt inspired. Let's see. Do Eastern Catholics have a response to the question, why do they pray for the dead if purgatory a no-no? I spoke to Russian Eastern Orthodox and he said they help souls to get from hell before resurrection. Okay, well, yeah, there's a lot going on here. First of all, I mean, Eastern Catholics are required to accept purgatory in the same way that Latin Rite Catholics are. However, what is purgatory? That's the question. And what all does that really entail? What is accepted by the Eastern Catholics, I don't think does violence to what Eastern Orthodox are really saying. And it doesn't assume that purgatory, like, you're not bound as a Catholic to accept that purgatory is a physical location, and you're not bound to accept that there's some actual material fire, or that fire is identified with the fires of the lake of fire, something like that. Those are all caricatures of purgatory. Now, they're partly rooted in people who actually did believe that, who were Catholics, but was that actually taught by the church? No. So really, at the end of the day, when you say it's a no-no, well, what are you talking about a no-no? What the church actually teaches about purgatory? That's not a no-no. Everybody has to accept that. Eastern Catholics, Eastern Catholics, Latin Rite Catholics. But what does it actually teach is really the question. And it's not this other stuff. So I don't think what Eastern Catholics are accepting is really something that is substantially different than what some Eastern Orthodox would say. Some. Because there is no consistent view among Eastern Orthodoxy of the afterlife. There's no consistent view, so I can't say that Eastern Catholicism is compatible identifiably with Eastern Orthodoxy, because there is no Eastern Orthodox view on the afterlife that is consistent here. There are views. And so I would say Eastern Catholicism is compatible with some of the views of those who are Eastern Orthodox on the afterlife. Now, the question of helping souls get from hell before the resurrection is not universally accepted by Eastern Orthodox. I mean, there are plenty of Eastern Orthodox who would reject that notion. But was it, how do you pronounce his name? Staniloe? I'm always corrected by the Romanians on how to pronounce his name. But in his dogmatic treatises, first volume, he talks about how prayers for the dead could apply to those who are damned. You know, they committed mortal sin, they're damned. But they're like barely damned. They're like at the highest point of the damned. They're not like down there with Hitler, but they're at the highest point, and prayers could get them through that threshold into heaven before the resurrection, the general resurrection and the general judgment. So this would be a transition between the personal judgment and the final judgment. Some Orthodox hold to that, but then some reject that. And is there a strong case for that historically and patristically? No, there's not a strong case for that position. But is an Orthodox in heresy if they were to say that? No, I wouldn't say they're in heresy, because they don't have a dogma here to begin with. It hasn't been defined anywhere. So they're not in heresy, but is it a strong argument? No. Others are going to say in the Orthodox tradition that the prayers of the dead aren't beneficial in transitioning them from hell to heaven, but they are just there to ease the sufferings of those in hell. And they'll point to like Luke 16. So could we concede that there could be some ease of sufferings through our intercession? Perhaps. I don't see that why that's a huge deal. But is that all that we can say? Or is that really the purpose of praying for the dead? Is that the only purpose of praying for the dead? I would say no, because I would say that there is this encounter with Christ that we experience when we die. And that is what we call purgatory. So you can see that purifying fire of Christ, that presence of Christ as God is a consuming fire, that is purgatory. And that's the purgatorial fire we're referring to. It's that encounter with Christ at the judgment. You're encountering a consuming God who is a consuming fire, if you will, as Scripture speaks of. So maybe go and read Spe Salvi by Benedict XVI, paragraphs 46 through 47, and he talks about this there. Do you think someone can be a saint if he rejects filioque, beatific vision, absolute divine or simplicity of God? First of all, depends on what you mean by absolute simplicity, right? I mean, we know that that's a loaded term, but I know where Astrofire is probably coming from here. When you say reject, obstinately reject? No. But did Gregory Palamas obstinately reject those things? I would say no. Obstinate rejection, I would define as you know it to be true, but you're rejecting it. Did Gregory Palamas reject something he knew to be true? No. I wouldn't say that's the case. So okay. Astrofire says Florence is super clear on what? Let's see what else we have. If you could speak with one famous or well-known influencer to attempt to convert them, who would it be? I don't know, because I don't really watch people on YouTube like that. I don't know. Joe Rogan, I guess he's an influencer, right? Joe Rogan. I'm going with Joe Rogan. Let's see. Follow-up question: when they do get baptized, then the real baptism cleanse all their previous sins, even though baptism of desire might have already. if God had already given them the grace extra sacramentally, then the sacramental grace that they're receiving wouldn't need to redo something that was already done. However, are there some graces that come sacramentally that you don't receive through baptism of desire? Yes. So as I've heard, baptism of desire, the grace that you receive there is enough to remit eternal guilt, but it does not deal with temporal guilt. Whereas the sacramental grace that you receive as baptism does deal with temporal guilt. So that would be a difference. But it's not a difference of removing eternal guilt. Photius and Mark of Ephesus were schismatic. It's clear to anyone who reads them. I would say that materially, you could say there was some elements of schism among Mark of Ephesus, but formally, was he a schismatic? I would say no. I would be very, very hesitant to make that kind of claim on his soul. I ultimately think it's up to God or the church to evaluate that question. So materially, yes, but materially doesn't necessarily mean you're damned. So, as far as Photius died in communion with Rome. So I think that's inappropriate to speak of him in that way. I think it's impious to make the comment that you're making, because when you say he's a fanatic, be very careful. You're speaking of somebody who died in communion with the church as a fanatic. I think that's an impious statement. So yeah, I think you need to evaluate your words there. What else we have? Looking through here. Great job on Cameron's channel. Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope it was helpful. Let's see. Do you think it's possible to be saved while eating pineapple on pizza? I don't know, because I've never had pineapple on pizza. So beards and unleavened bread are not church dividing issues. Well, I think we're all in agreement there. I don't know a whole lot of Orthodox that are saying these days that it is. And so that being said, I do think that the issue of leavened bread is I think that leavened bread is more preferable, because I want to say it's more ideal than the unleavened issue, but I don't think it's a church dividing issue. It's not an essential issue. It's not like that. And beards, yeah, come on. Look, I'm obviously in favor of beards, but that's not an issue. So I agree with you. But I mean, how many Orthodox are really out there saying that these are still an issue? You might find some Orthobros online, but who's honestly who is a significant person in the discussion between Catholicism and Orthodoxy actually taking those people seriously? Nobody who's seriously is a significant figure in Catholicism or Orthodoxy is really talking about that and defends that kind of view. So, let's see. Am I still going on Pints with Aquinas? Yeah, that'll be next month. Okay. Florence is clear on God's simplicity. Yeah, but the question is, what does it mean by simplicity? It teaches that there is no multiplicity in the attributes of God. Everything is one except the relations of opposition. Florence. First of all, I think that's reading into Florence, but second of all, it doesn't engage the question of, number one, is Florence even definitive on that? And then number two, is that truly incompatible with the essence and energies, or even the formal distinction? I don't think so. If so, are you saying Scotists are damned now? Or is that your position, Astrofire? Please put that in the chat. I really I'm curious, because if you're not going to damn the Scotists, then you can't damn the Palamites either, because it's effectively the same thing. So please let me know in the chat. Are you excommunicating all Scotists now through that position? Is that the position we're going to take now? I would refer you to people like Dr. Goff and Father Christian Kappas, and my interviews with them. I think they're much more capable at this discussion than I am, and they're certainly not going to come to the conclusions that you have. And you need to ask why. Why is that? So maybe perhaps engage their content. but I'm looking. Let's see. SCOTUS, no, but I do believe that their doctrine is dangerous. Okay, well, great, but then you need to say the same thing about Palamas. Okay, so because it's, again, as you know, Scholarius is going to say the formal distinction is what Gregory Palamas is getting at. And he says, I've watched their material. Okay, great. And reach out to them with any further questions that you have, because they're able to offer a whole lot more pushback in this area, since that's their area of expertise. Palamism is not Scotism. I understand that, but substantially the dispute that you're making here about the attributes, that part is identifiable. So again, go and have a discussion with them with any of the pushback that you might offer, because I want to say that they're much more capable at interacting with that point than I am. It's not my area of expertise, but I have seen enough from them to know that this is a non-issue. But is it my area of expertise? No, it is theirs though. So, and they don't come to your position. Why is that? And is this your area of expertise? If so, okay, please respond to their arguments and their pushback that they would offer to what you're saying. Let's see. I'm absolutely convinced that Pope Francis and Archbishop Bartholomew debate about beards and bread every time they meet. Maybe. Although councils do not formally endorse Thomism, yet they're very Thomistic in their doctrine of God. I think that that's assuming certain things. And it's also not considering some other aspects where I think the Franciscans were involved in some of these councils and formulating some of these councils. But anyways, let's see. Please don't forget my comment. At least consider it in your mind. I don't remember what the comment was, so I guess I've already violated your admonition. I apologize. I don't remember offhand. Can you remind me in the chat? Just if you can quickly put it in there. Jog my memory here. What am I not to forget? Absurd Scandal says that was it. Okay, I'm confused. maybe put it in the comment section there, or just shoot me a message later on. Let me know what it is you're referring to. Just did at Reason and Theology. I don't get it. I don't get it. Looking through the comments, see if I can make sense of it, but I'm still not understanding. So yeah, maybe okay, reading between the lines. I'm still lost. I'm sorry. Have I had a chance to look at the PDFs I sent in email? Not yet. I unfortunately haven't. So give me a little bit more time. Absurd Scandal says no link. Yeah, it doesn't allow links if you try to put something in the chat. It won't come up for the rest of us. Astrofire says, I'm trying to understand your position. Are you saying that Palamas did not teach a real multiplicity of attributes prior to the act of intellect considering God? What do you mean by real? That's the question. And you would know that if you watch those interviews. Go back and watch the interviews again. What do you mean by real? That's the question. Do you mean real as in the formal distinction? Is that a real multiplicity? Well, you weren't willing to condemn the Scotists for holding to that. So why are you condemning the Palamites when Gennadius Scholarius is telling you that what Palamas is saying about the attributes is the formal distinction of the Scotists? I think you need to consider that. So you say you've watched the videos, maybe go and rewatch them, and maybe go and read the corpus of Father Compass on this issue. In fact, he wrote a whole dissertation recently, his second doctoral dissertation on this issue. So reach out to him, see what he says. Real in the sense that prior to me thinking about God, the distinction is already present in the mind. Yeah, I understand, but there's a more harder version of that and a softer version of that. Again, do you mean it in the sense of the formal distinction? If so, you weren't willing to condemn the Scotists. Why are you condemning the Palamites when Gennadius Scholarius is telling you they're identified? Once more, please go and talk to Father Compass, because he's done a whole doctoral dissertation on this area. Have you read his second doctoral dissertation? That would be something for you to consider. Any other questions there in the chat? See the Holy Lie clip from my comedy mixtape. I'll check it out, but you know, I'm not going to do a whole lot of those very often, so don't get your hopes up there. Our Lefebvrites or Lefebvre schismatics have plenty of videos on the SSPX. So go and watch those. Just type in Michael Lofton SSPX and you'll get a good answer for that. All right, that's going to do it. I appreciate y'all watching. I'm going to come back and do another stream here in just a little bit on let's see, it's going to be John Henry Newman and some of his views on the magisterium that I think y'all will find interesting and helpful. So certainly stay tuned for that. All right, we'll see you later. God bless.
Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.